remember helping her move to her place in Parowan, Utah. And it was all fun and games.
Probably
and
not. Okay, great. I don't. It's just. It's too heartbreaking. It puts me in a bad place.
The moment Robyn sits down for that interview, something feels off. Her voice sounds steady. Her posture looks practiced. The words come out smooth, too smooth. This was not a conversation. This was a cleanup job. And the audience felt it right away. Not sadness, not sympathy, betrayal. Because this was not gossip being pushed across the screen. This was history being rewritten in real time, right in front of people who watched every season, every argument, every promise, every financial crack that showed up on camera. The message was clear. Trust us now. Forget what you saw before. And that was the mistake. This interview was meant to close the book. Instead, it ripped pages out and scattered them everywhere. Fans did not lean back. They leaned forward. Screenshots came out. Old clips resurfaced. Property records got pulled. Viewers were not treated like witnesses. They were treated like they would not remember. And that insult landed hard. Because Sister Wives is not a rumor mill. It is 14 seasons of footage. Receipts exist. The cameras never blinked. When Robyn speaks about fairness and shared sacrifice, the mind does not wander. It rewinds. It goes back to the houses, the moves, the choices, the moments when words did not match actions. This is where the tone shifts. This stops being about hurt feelings. This becomes about truth. The interview tried to sell a story where no one was favored, where everyone gave equally, where pain landed on one person unfairly. But the audience knows better. They watched the imbalance grow year after year. They tracked it without trying. And here is the part that stings. This interview assumed people forgot. Forgot the work history. Forgot the financial stress. Forgot who carried weight while others stayed protected. That assumption did more damage than silence ever could. Because when viewers feel underestimated, they respond with focus. They dig. They compare, they line up past and present until the cracks show clearly. And once that happens, there is no going back. One sentence from Robyn shifts everything. One word, said calmly, confidently. And once you hear it, the entire story starts to fall apart. Before this interview ever happened, the family was already cracking. Long before cameras followed separate lives. Long before goodbyes became permanent. The breakdown did not arrive all at once. The shift happened slowly, season after season, conversation after conversation. Small moments stacked up until trust felt thin. At the start, the structure felt clear. One husband, 4 wives, shared values, shared goals, shared struggle. Everyone spoke about unity with confidence. Everyone promised fairness with a straight face. Early seasons leaned hard on the idea of balance. Time rotation, emotional support. Resources spread evenly. Viewers heard those words and watched closely. Then patterns started forming. Not loud ones, quiet ones. Certain homes felt calmer. Certain voices carried more weight. Decisions leaned the same way more often. The tension did not explode. The tension simmered. Viewers noticed changes before the family admitted any existed. Christine stopped smiling the same way. Janelle started sounding tired instead of steady. Mary pulled inward. Robyn appeared more central. Kody grew sharper, less patient, less willing to hear pushback. Conversations turned defensive. Disagreements lingered longer. Unity turned into management. Here is where long-time viewers feel seen. None of this arrived suddenly. Every concern built slowly on camera. Every emotional withdrawal played out in real scenes. Trust eroded through moments people remember clearly. Missed support. Unequal attention. Promises delayed again and again. And somewhere in the middle of all this, money stopped being spoken about directly. Finances became the quiet tension sitting in every room. Nobody named the problem out loud. Yet every move pointed back to resources. Who lived where? Who moved when? Who carried financial stress alone? Viewers watched conversations where emotions filled the space while numbers stayed hidden. Work histories told a story without being highlighted. Lifestyle differences showed up in plain sight. Nobody needed spreadsheets to feel the imbalance. The discomfort spoke for itself. This matters for newer viewers. Nothing here comes from rumor. Everything unfolded across seasons. The interview did not open wounds. The interview poked scars everyone already recognized. Pain existed before microphones turned on. By the time the family sat down for damage control, trust had already drained out. Words no longer carried the same weight. Familiar phrases sounded hollow. Claims of fairness landed flat because memory stayed sharp. And as emotions fade from the front of the conversation, something else steps forward quietly. Numbers. Ownership. Contribution. Lifestyle. Once attention shifts there, the story changes tone. Because feelings fade, money leaves a trail. The interview itself is where the story starts to unravel. Not because of what was asked, but because of how the answers were delivered. Robyn did not sound confused. She did not sound emotional. She sounded prepared. Her tone stayed even. Her pauses felt measured. Her body language stayed closed, but controlled. This was not someone processing pain. This was someone presenting a version. Words mattered here. Phrases like fairness and unity were repeated carefully. Not explained, repeated. The language stayed vague on purpose. No timelines, no specifics, no numbers, just reassurance. The kind meant to calm an audience without giving them anything solid to test. Viewers noticed that right away. Longtime fans are fluent in this family's history. They know when reactions are raw and when they are rehearsed. This did not feel like a conversation unfolding. It felt like a statement being delivered, calm on the surface, defensive underneath. The framing was clear. Everyone suffered equally. No one was favored. Decisions were shared. Pain landed unfairly on one person. That story was pushed gently but firmly. And that is exactly why it failed. Because fairness, when real, does not need to be announced this often. Unity, when intact, does not need this much explanation. The more the interview leaned on those words, the louder the absence became. No examples. No acknowledgement of visible imbalance. No recognition of past contradictions shown on camera. Fans did not reject the interview because they wanted drama. They rejected it because it asked them to forget their own eyes. It asked them to unsee years of footage, to accept that everything felt uneven only because they misunderstood it. Controlled frustration built fast. Social feeds filled with side-by-side clips. Old episodes resurfaced. Fans compared tone now to tone then. Confidence replaced uncertainty. Certainty replaced nuance. The contrast was impossible to ignore. This is where doubt turns into suspicion. Not about motives, about honesty. When language becomes too polished and memory stays sharp, trust collapses quietly. Then one phrase lands and changes how everything is heard. Equal contribution. Said casually, as if it explains everything. As if it ends the conversation. Instead, it opens a new one. Once the phrase equal contribution enters the conversation, money can no longer stay in the background. Feelings stop leading. Facts step forward. Because contribution is not an emotion, it is measurable. And the show gave viewers years of material to measure it. Across the series, work history was never hidden. Janelle worked consistently. She spoke openly about responsibility and stability. Christine carried the weight of childcare and home life for years. That labor was visible, even if it was never paid. Mary maintained income streams and independence long after emotional support disappeared. These roles were shown repeatedly on camera. Robyn's situation looked different. Viewers saw long stretches without outside work. They saw support systems built around protection rather than contribution. That contrast was not subtle. It did not require interpretation. It played out naturally over seasons. Lifestyle differences made the gap harder to ignore. Housing choices stood side by side. Some lived tight, some downsized, some sacrificed comfort. Others remained stable and insulated. These were not imagined differences. They were filmed, shown, discussed briefly, and then brushed past. This is why numbers matter more than feelings. Feelings change, narratives shift, but resources tell the truth quietly. Who moved into what? Who paid what? Who absorbed risk? Who stayed secure? Those details linger long after emotional explanations fade. The interview tried to flatten all of this into shared struggle. But shared struggle requires shared cost. Viewers could not reconcile that claim with what they remembered watching. Not because they wanted to accuse anyone, because the math never lined up. Discomfort is the right response here. Not outrage. Discomfort. The kind that settles in when something you trusted no longer fits together. When words clash with memory. When contribution gets redefined to avoid scrutiny. This is the point where the story stops being personal and becomes structural. It is no longer about who felt hurt. It is about who carried weight and who was protected from it. And once weight enters the discussion, attention shifts naturally to assets. Land. Titles. Ownership. Because if contribution was equal, the paper should reflect it. Coyote Pass was sold as the reset. A fresh start. A shared future where old mistakes would not follow them. On camera, the promises were clear. Equal land. Equal opportunity. A place where everyone would finally feel secure. The family talked about legacy. About building something together that would outlast the chaos. Viewers believed that vision because it was repeated often. Meetings were filmed, maps were shown, lines were drawn in the dirt. The dream was not vague, it was detailed. And that made what happened next harder to ignore. Time passed, and nothing moved forward. Plans stalled, deadlines slipped, conversations looped without resolution. The land stayed untouched, while lives around it shifted dramatically. Some wives waited, some adapted, some lost patience. The dream did not collapse loudly, it faded quietly. What viewers noticed over time was not just the lack of progress. It was who remained comfortable while others absorbed instability. Temporary solutions became permanent for some. Sacrifice was uneven. The longer the delay stretched, the clearer that imbalance became. This is where disbelief sets in. Because if the land truly represented shared commitment, urgency would have followed. Instead, urgency appeared selective. Decisions slowed when accountability came up. Momentum disappeared when fairness needed definition. Coyote Pass stopped feeling like a future and started looking like leverage. A symbol held just out of reach. Something discussed enough to keep hope alive, but never resolved enough to demand answers. Fans did not need a single explosive moment to reach conviction. The pattern did the work. Rewatching earlier episodes only sharpened it. Promises stayed the same, outcomes did not. And that gap grew impossible to explain away. This is the turning point. Suspicion hardens into certainty. Because dreams that benefit everyone do not stall this long without reason. So the question shifts naturally. Not who was patient, not who complained, but who benefited while the dream stayed unfinished. After the dream stalled, real life kept moving. And the contrast between lives became impossible to ignore. Not in theory, in practice. On camera. Janelle's RV period said more than any interview ever could. She was not chasing freedom. She was adapting to limitation, downsizing, making do, talking openly about finances and stability while trying to stay loyal to a plan that never moved. The RV was framed as independence, but it looked like compromise, a visible sign of strain. Christine's story moved in the opposite direction. Her exit was not sudden. It was the result of years of unmet needs. When she left, the change was immediate, lighter, calmer, healthier. Viewers watched her rebuild with clarity and relief. That contrast mattered. Leaving did not break her. Staying did. Mary's situation stayed complicated, financially independent yet emotionally isolated. She worked. She contributed. She waited. Her conflict was not about money alone. It was about belonging, about being present without being prioritized. Independence kept her stable, but it never brought security inside the family structure. These three paths told the same story from different angles. Emotional strain and financial pressure do not land evenly. They expose fault lines. They force choices. Some people adjust. Some people escape. Some people endure. This is where the story becomes personal for viewers. These are not abstract debates. These are lived consequences. One wife sleeping in an RV. One starting over and thriving. One standing alone inside a marriage that barely acknowledged her presence. What makes this heavier is what does not happen. No public correction. No clear defense. No visible urgency to address the imbalance. Silence stretches across seasons. And silence carries weight, because when words stop, patterns speak. And in this family, the quiet says more than any explanation ever could. After the interview aired, something noticeable did not happen. No unified response. No public defense from the other wives. No one stepped forward to back the narrative being presented. In a family that once spoke endlessly about unity, that absence stood out. Viewers watched closely. Not just episodes, but timing. Social media activity slowed or shifted. Posts avoided the topic. Silence replaced clarification. When people who usually explain everything suddenly explain nothing, it becomes part of the story. This was not loud disagreement. It was distance. And distance communicates clearly. If the claims of fairness and equal contribution were true, this would have been the moment to say so. Even briefly. Even gently. That moment never came. Instead, each woman stayed in her own lane, focused on her own life, her own work, her own future. The lack of coordination felt intentional, as if speaking up would require saying something they could not support. Absence becomes a statement when history is long. These women had years to defend each other publicly. They had done it before. The choice not to now felt deliberate. Viewers did not need confirmation. They read the quiet correctly. This is where the narrative shifts again. Not because of new information, but because of who stays silent. When silence lines up with visible patterns, it stops being neutral. At this point, the question is no longer whether the interview told the full truth. The question becomes who had the power to shape the story in the first place. And that leads back to one person. Cody's contradictions are subtle, but they build over time. On camera, he often speaks confidently, yet when past decisions are brought up, his explanations shift. One week a choice is described as necessary for family harmony. The next week, the same choice becomes about fairness or protection. Nothing stays consistent long enough to feel credible. Viewers notice this because they have context. They remember prior seasons, prior interviews, moments captured without editing. Cody's defensiveness shows up not just in words, but in posture, tone, and timing. Arms cross. Eyebrows tighten. Sentences start calm, but end clipped. It's not explosive, but it signals discomfort. Subtle cracks appear every time someone challenges his account. The contradictions pile quietly, season after season. One week he emphasizes equality. Another week he admits certain arrangements were made for Robyn's comfort. Later, he frames it as logistical necessity. These shifts are minor individually, but together they create a pattern. A long-term rhythm of adjustment that tells a different story than the one being sold in interviews. Even when Robyn tries to reinforce fairness, Cody's previous statements reappear like ghosts. They clash with the current narrative. Fans don't just feel confusion, they feel skepticism. They know when consistency is lacking, and that knowledge forces them to question motives, not just words. The instability of his explanations creates tension in every scene. When he talks, Viewers are listening for what isn't said, as much as what is. Every defensive phrase becomes evidence of a repeating pattern rather than a one-off moment. The more Kody defends, the more history surfaces. The more the pattern strengthens. And this is key. It's not one slip. It's continuous. Confidence masks uncertainty. Control masks avoidance. Each contradiction is a building block in a structure that eventually undermines credibility, which brings the focus back to Robyn. Because all these contradictions frame her central claim. The claim that everyone contributed equally. The claim that fairness was always upheld. The claim that she acted within the rules. These words now carry far more weight because history has already started contradicting them. The phrase equal contribution was supposed to settle questions, to smooth over years of tension. Instead, it became the center of disbelief. Fans did not reject it because it sounded harsh. They rejected it because it contradicted everything they had seen. Every season had recorded sacrifices, compromises, and invisible labor. Every camera angle had captured who carried weight and who stayed protected. Longtime viewers felt a deep sense of finality in that moment. It was no longer about who was upset or who needed sympathy. It was about truth. And when the truth was spoken confidently but ignored reality, credibility cracked, not in a single snap. Slowly, systematically, irreversibly. Fans reacted so strongly because this was not a minor misstatement. It was the linchpin of the narrative. Claiming equal contribution when visual and financial evidence showed otherwise felt like an insult. Years of observation were dismissed with a single line. The audience had invested time, emotion, and attention. They expected honesty. They got a performance. That betrayal hit hard. Trust is fragile, but in this case, it did not just bend, it broke. The cumulative effect of rehearsed phrasing, selective silence, stalled dreams, and contradictory explanations made viewers question not only the interview, but the motives behind it. Once trust erodes on this level, no statement, clarification, or apology can fully repair it. The collapse is not loud. It does not require shouting. It is the quiet recognition that the story presented no longer matches the story documented. Evidence accumulates. Patterns emerge. The audience sees imbalance clearly. Credibility cannot return once comparison exposes contradiction. And yet, the question remains, what happens next for the family? For the show itself? The episode leaves more than answers, it raises uncertainty. Viewers are left with consequences playing out in slow motion. Lives, relationships, and reputations shift, while cameras keep rolling, silently recording the next chapter. Because when credibility collapses, the ripples are not confined to one moment. They spread across every season that follows, every choice that comes next, and every interaction that was once taken at face value. The audience is now watching differently, and that changes everything. By the time the dust settles, the balance of power has shifted. The family may have tried to control the narrative, but the audience now holds the lens. Every decision, every claim, every word is being watched, replayed, and judged. Social media, forums, and fan discussions have become the new court. The interview that was meant to close the story instead handed the viewers the gavel. Meanwhile, the other wives continue their lives with a quiet resilience. Christine rebuilt stability and independence. Janelle found ways to adapt while holding herself accountable to her own standards. Mary maintained autonomy despite emotional and financial challenges. Their actions, their choices, speak louder than any words from the interview. They demonstrate what it means to move forward when structures fail you. Accountability is no longer theoretical. It is measured in visible outcomes. Who thrives? Who sacrifices? Who protects others? The cameras may have followed the family for years, but now the audience decides whose story is credible. Every claim is compared against history, evidence, and lived experience. And in that comparison, truth emerges slowly, quietly, but undeniably. Yet, closure is unresolved. The interview did not restore balance. It exposed patterns, contradictions, and failures that cannot easily be repaired. Trust has been fractured permanently, and some questions remain unanswered. Viewers are left reflecting on fairness, contribution, and the realities of this family's structure. There is no comfort in the answers, only understanding of what was, what is, and what may come. Now, the question passes to the audience. If you had been watching every season, every move, every promise, how would you measure fairness? How would you hold accountability when claims conflict with evidence? And as the family moves forward, which choices would you trust? Because the story does not end here. It continues in the decisions made behind closed doors, in the lives rebuilt, and in the eyes of an audience that refuses to be misled. The interview is over, but the consequences echo. And the viewers, finally in control of the narrative, are left to decide what the truth really means.